team here this morning. Thank you so much for coming here. And then we've got two sessions this morning, so we're going to divide them up into two sessions. The first session, I'm just going to do a standard introduction to Islam and what it is. Because the challenge is always, as my brother and I discussed yesterday, witnessing to Muslims is a difficult thing to do. Sharing the gospel, it's a challenge. And part of that challenge, to some extent, is not helped by the fact that many Christians, for the most part, are not knowledgeable on Islam at all. Okay. Now, I can speak to this with a tremendous amount of conviction and also personal experience, because my introduction to apologetics was a rather blunt introduction. Okay. I became a Christian at school when I was at high school, and was fairly faithful in my faith whilst I was at school. But when I left high school, I became a prodigal son. So I was chasing after all the wrong things, wine, woman, and song, and we all know that heads down the same old mine shaft that it always goes down. I was invited back to church by friends of mine, and I rededicated my life to Christ and said a few prayers which God honored. And the Lord began to work in my life and change things. And it's a process. It's the story of my life. And one of the main things that happened in my Christian walk was I was living in London at this stage, and I was invited to go to a place called Speaker's Corner in London, which is a place of evangelism, street evangelism, and public debate. And whilst I was there, the Muslims, trying to interact with the Muslims literally took the Bible out of my hand, went to Deuteronomy chapter 18 and said Muhammad is prophesied in the Old Testament, went to John chapter 14 and said Muhammad is prophesied in the New Testament, and I was like, no ways, I had no idea. And then they proceeded to say to me, you come here, presume to speak to us, you don't even know your own Bible, you've never read the Quran, disappear, move off. Yeah, but more colorful language than that. Yeah. And that's what I was to some extent. It wasn't that I didn't love the Lord or have a big heart for Him. It's just I didn't know. Fortunately for me, there were people there who were making some arguments with the Muslims and making an impact and answering the actual questions that the Muslims were asking. It's just that I wasn't. Well, one of those persons turned out to be my wife. So that's where I actually met my wife. So in some sense, I have the Lord to thank for the Muslims, because it's through them that I got to know my wife. And it's through them that the Lord, and I'm going to say this, He disciplined me. He exposed that I was, despite being His son, that I was an ignorant man. And nobody likes to be told that they're ignorant. But the truth is, either you are or you're not. And if you don't like to admit that you're an ignorant person, then you've got an issue with pride. And so that was my introduction to apologetics. It was a rather blunt introduction. And so just through that ministry that I got to meet a lot of people who were doing ministry to Muslims, I ended up going and focusing a lot on that. And then I went to go and study apologetics in the US, and my wife had her own journey. She was also there, and the Lord used that. And so that was where I cut my teeth on learning about apologetics. Most of our apologetic effort was focused on responding to the Muslims and the objections they have. More recently, the Islamic Propagation Center from Durban, which was founded by Ahmed Deedat. Ahmed Deedat, if you don't know who he is, was a very famous Muslim scholar, born in South Africa, grew up here. He started the Islamic Propagation Center in Durban, which has existed for many decades and has been one of the main instruments globally at spreading Islam to all peoples. Huge publications come from there. It operates out of Durban. And he was a beacon of Islamic courage and defending the Islamic position against the Christians. Okay, globally. Even today, if you listen to many of the well-known Islamic scholars around the world, they all refer to Deedat as a landmark individual in their lives, which is unfortunate, because if you examine a lot of Deedat's work, I think it's porous and poor. Nevertheless, he's got the ball rolling, and a lot of people to this day see him as a significant individual who's laid waste to Christianity. Now, interestingly enough, there was a South African man whom I believe God raised up, who was the perfect antidote to Ahmed Deedat. God always raises another voice. So, mark this name down. John Gilchrist. Gilchrist. He was a lawyer from Johannesburg. He is a godly man, and one of the greatest tragedies in the churches in South Africa is here in South Africa, we had amongst our churches one of the best Christian responses to Islam in the whole world, in our own backyard, and yet we didn't even know who he was. Because you know what? The church in South Africa said, Islam is not a problem. Islam is not an issue. Okay. John Gilchrist has published some of the most helpful works at an introductory level to help Christians understand and respond to many of the same objections that the Muslims raise today. If you go to the top website that I would recommend to you, is in a website called Answering Islam. And if you do a search on John Gilchrist, you will find some of his publications on there for free. There are three I want to draw your attention to. The one is an introduction to Muslims and Islam, understanding Islam. There's another one on Muhammad, and there's another one on the Quran. Those three books are extremely accessible, extremely well written, and very helpful. He published many other things, all of which are for free on that site. So there's a name, and there's somebody who can help you tremendously. 3 weeks ago, I debated a Muslim scholar from the Islamic Propagation Center. And so you catching me right off of the back of that debate. So my only challenge this morning is how to cut out everything I would want to say, such that we could, first of all, lay down a foundation on the basics of Islam. And then in the second session, we want to look how are we going to deal with some of the Islamic objections. And we can't focus on everything now. We can't do all of Islamic history. We can't dive into their philosophy or the depth of their theology. We just don't have enough time. We could do an entire conference on Islam for a week long, and we would still not be bottoming that. But we have to start somewhere, and I have to give you enough so that you're not completely ignorant of Islam, but you've got enough knowledge of that. And then in the second session, where does the rubber typically hit the road in evangelism that's going to happen here in Makondo? When you go to the shops down here, and since I left Natal, all the towns in South Africa now have a mosque built in them. When I was growing up, there were no mosques. Now every town has a mosque, and often it's in a prominent place as well. Okay, so let's get going now. Islam, next slide. Islam does not mean peace. It means submission, and a Muslim is one who submits. And it's very important, if we're to understand Islam, as it is with Christianity and many other things, is we always need to try and understand something of the history, to know something about the geography, the context in which these things are happening, and the events. And this is very important, and the dates are also very important as well. Okay, next slide. So we are here. We are a modern-day Saudi Arabian peninsula. Okay, this is where it all begins for the Muslims. All right, Islam is born out of these two towns, Mecca and Medina. These are the two most important towns to know about, and then right behind that would be Jerusalem, I would argue. Okay, that's the second most or the third most important city, and there's reasons for that, and it's also the reason why there's just so much global consternation, because the most fought over piece of real estate on the face of the planet is that little hill in Jerusalem, on which you've got the foundation of the temple, on which the Muslims have built their mosque. Okay, the Dome of the Rock. Okay, but let's go back now and let's look a little bit into some of these early histories. Okay, now Islam was born in the medieval period, okay, and at the time of Muhammad, the prevailing religions in that region were Christianity and Judaism. Remember, by this time Christianity had been around for 600 years. Yemen used to be a Jewish nation, by the way. Okay, And there were Jews from Yemen all the way through to modern-day Israel. There was also pagan belief systems in the region. Okay, next slide. Okay, and it was claimed by the Muslims that what happened is that Muhammad grew up in this context, okay, and he was interacting with these belief systems at his time, the polytheism and animism of the local tribes, Christianity and Judaism. He was interacting with that. That's easy enough to establish. And at the center of Mecca, and importantly Mecca, was a structure called the Kaaba, which was a building which is at the center of this town, at which the people would perform various religious festivals and rites and so forth and so on. And people were already making pilgrimages to Mecca to visit the site. This is going to become important because it's going to be the foundation for the Hajj, which we're going to learn about. Okay, so this is where we are geographically. We're in modern-day Saudi Arabia. Next slide. These are your important dates. Muhammad is born, nobody knows exactly when, but around 570. Okay? He's born. He becomes an orphan, and he's raised by his uncle, Abu Talib, and he's of the Hashemite clan, okay, who are a subgroup of the Umayyad dynasty. Okay, so he's born into a tribal culture. He's raised by his uncle. He was an illiterate man. This is very important. And he was a hard worker. And so for most of his young life, he was working the caravans, the trading caravans, where they would be trading up and down this vast expanse of the desert. And he was, up until the age of around 25, he was working as a young man. At that age, he fell in love with a woman older than him, a woman by the name of Khadija. She was about 40, and they got married. So his first wife was this woman, okay? She was a very wealthy woman, and of course, once he married into that wealth, he no longer had to work as hard as he had in the past. And so he had more time, I think, for reflection and contemplation. And around 610, when he was about 40 years old, okay, he begins to receive or have these religious experiences, of which we have quite a lot of detail. Okay, so for example, in this book here, written by Al-Azami, he talks about a lot of that. Now, this is an Islamic text attempting to argue for the historical reliability of the Quran, the first one that I was ever aware of. He talks about a lot of this in here, the doctrine of Wahy, which is their understanding of inspiration. And it is claimed that he had an encounter with the angel Gabriel, who basically would confront him and tell him to recite. Okay, so he would say certain things, and Muhammad had to recount it back to him, and then the angel would make sure that that was correct. And that's how they believe that the revelation of the Quran was given from Allah down to Muhammad through the supervision of the angel Gabriel. Okay, it's a very different understanding of inspiration from that of the Christians, and how we understand the Bible is inspired. And that's an important question, I think, to ask. He received some of these revelations in a cave. There's the cave there, apparently, that he went into. But he received these revelations not in one sitting, but over his life period from 610 up until his death around 630 and 632. If we go back. So we're those dates. So he lived to about 60, 62, and then he passed away. So he got revelations from about 610 to 622. And this is important then that we know about, because we can actually track Muhammad's life in the Islamic sources. Unfortunately, the Quran is not very helpful in this respect, because it doesn't give us, unlike the Bible, there's no chronology in it. The Quran is kind of haphazardly put together with the basic principle of the longest books are at the beginning and the shortest books are at the end. Okay, so you don't know when in the life of Muhammad those things are happening. You have to know the history in order to know that this surah was when he was in this part of Mecca and this part of Medina. And that's why it makes it a nightmare to read, because it's just all over the place. Okay, it's just very haphazard. And I encourage you to read it because you will experience that for sure. It's not like in the Bible where you find the story in the Gospels of Jesus' prophecies, his birth, and as a young boy going to the temple, starting his ministry, his work up until the crucifixion, and then you find the book of Acts. It's historical, it's a timeline. It's like reading 1st and 2nd Kings. Or Chronicles, or 1st and 2nd Samuel. There's history there, okay? And it's not like that. And this is important because he's receiving these revelations now. So some important things for us to need to say about that time is Muhammad started getting these revelations, and first of all, when he received them, he was kind of disturbed by these things. And his wife and others said to him, "No, you've encountered an angel, and God has selected you to be the true prophet." And so they began to listen to his teachings, and early on he developed a small group of followers, and he began to teach a strict monotheism within that region of Mecca, which was immediately at odds with the polytheism and the paganism. So it wasn't long before conflict arose between Muhammad and his followers and the people of Mecca. So much so that they were exiled, and eventually they had to flee from Mecca to Medina. So if you think of that map again, Medina is in the north, Mecca's below. So let's actually go back to that map. Let's pull that map back up again. So the conflict begins in Mecca, and then he flees to Medina in the north. Okay, the date that he leaves is 622. This is a very important date because it's the date from which the Muslims start their calendar. Like we take it from the birth of Christ, this is when they do their dating. Okay, it's from 622. The calendar is the Hijrah, which is the flight. Okay. Now, when Muhammad moves to Medina, that Medina was a city in which there were 3 Jewish tribes, and so Muhammad had interaction with these tribes, and he struck up some kind of treaties with them, an alliance with them. But unfortunately, what happened is Muhammad had brought war to that town, because his conflict with the Meccans had become such that the Meccans put together an army and went up to Medina to fight him and his followers. And there were some famous battles, one of which in which Muhammad was nearly killed. But nevertheless, Muhammad and his forces ultimately triumphed over the Meccans, and then Muhammad would then rally up a larger army and take an army from Medina down to Mecca and conquer the Meccans, and then he purged the Kaaba of all the idols, and he established his understanding of Islamic teaching and theology within Mecca. This is the standard historical narrative of what happened in Islam. Okay, so these things are important. What is often missed and failed to be mentioned is the significant conflict between himself and the Jewish tribes that happened in Medina. You can go and read about this on Answering Islam. Much of the animus today that exists between the Jewish people and the Muslims has its roots in Muhammad's conflict with the Jews back then, in my estimation. Okay. Such was the contempt that they ended up having between them, because Muhammad claimed to be a prophet of God, and the Jews said, "Well, if you're a prophet, show us a miracle," which he couldn't do. He said, "My words are miraculous," which didn't really impress the Jews. Okay. And so then they ended up accusing them of violating their treaties, and he was personally involved in the beheading of 650 Jewish men. This isn't a controversial statement. This is standard Islamic narrative. I think that much of the animus between the Jews and the Muslims begins back here. It's not to do with, whilst we talk about the Zionist movement in Israel and the movement of the Jews into Palestine, and there's all these arguments back and forth. A lot of those arguments, I think, are anachronistic. They're too late. The tension and the animus that we see between the Jews and the Muslims, we find in Muhammad's conflict with the Jews at the time, and in the Quran we can find many verses that have a very disparaging view of Jews. Okay, and what's interesting about that development is you can also see, if you know which verses were revealed to Muhammad, you can see a progression between the verses when he was down in Mecca, when he was much more religious, and then as he moves to Medina, he becomes a warrior. And so a lot of those chapters in the Quran are much more violent and militant, like Surah 9, for example. Okay. And so this is what makes Muhammad a difficult person to contend with, because you can find many things about him which are magnanimous and virtuous, but at the same time he was a warrior. And we can look at that in his life. So that's what's important then for us to understand. All right, let's just look now at Islam around the world. Who's in charge? Sheldon, are you going to keep time for me, brother? Okay, so can you give me a countdown? Where are we sitting now? How much time? Sorry? You've got 30 minutes. 30 minutes, okay. All right, so around the world, Islam is particularly in the 1040 corridor, your North African nations, the Middle East, and interestingly enough, the most populous Muslim country in the world is Indonesia. Okay, so these are the parts of the world profoundly affected by Islam. Ways of interacting with Muslims, okay? There's two ways that we're going to learn to interact with Muslims. There's the apologetic response, which is what we've been learning, of giving an answer to questions about Christianity. And what we're also going to learn about is polemics, which is 15 minutes until session 2. 15 minutes until session 2. 50. 1-5 to session 2. Okay. So this is important then that we do it. Polemic is asking questions of Islam, okay? We're going to learn both. But you can't really ask good questions of Islam if you don't know anything about Islam, okay? So what often happens with Christians who are diligent in studying apologetics is we always end up in fighting with the Muslims in our own backyard. And that's the way they want it. They don't want you to so we're constantly defending the faith, which is what we need to do, but we never ask critical questions of their own belief system. And a lot of people get really offended when you do polemics, because you end up with this kind of nonsense. Look here, I'm just trying to love the Muslims. I'm not trying to argue with them. Now that sounds really pious, but that's actually pious nonsense, and it's unbiblical. Okay? Contending for the faith, as John would argue, is a biblical principle. Paul is doing it, Apollos is doing it, Jesus is doing it. Jesus is arguing with people all the time. We make a distinction between being argumentative and arguing or contending for truth because we fear for that person's predicament. So this notion that you can love people well and never contend for the truth in their lives is just false. And it's not biblical. It's a hard thing to do. That's why people don't want to do this, because you have to do homework and you have to go and study to show yourself approved. Okay, so some of the beliefs we need to know: they believe in Allah. This is just a generic term for God. And one thing that was pointed out to me, which is very interesting, is nowhere in the Quran will you find the biblical names of God, which is very interesting, hey? Because the Muslims believe that the Quran is a further revelation. They believe in the prophets of the Old Testament, so they believe in the Torah, and many of the prophets that we believe in, and they also believe in the Gospels and the Injil, and they believe in Jesus. They call him Isa, okay? But they also believe that this is a legitimate, and it's telling to me that the name of Yahweh is never mentioned in this text. I mean, if God exists, He has a name which He gave to us, and it seems like that's fairly important. This is going to become very important in our polemics. Now, this is very, very helpful to me. It's important to understand that in the same way we as Christians see the Bible as the ultimate authority, since it's God's word, they have the same view that we have the scriptures as of the Quran. They just think that the Bible is corrupted. Okay, so that's how they view this. But in addition to this, and this is very important, you've got to understand that Muslims will often, when they're speaking to you, that they are appealing to a corpus of texts. So friends, do this for me. At the center of this is the Quran, the most important. Think of it as concentric circles. Next most important is the Hadith. What is the Hadith? The Hadith in some sense is like the early church fathers' writings, okay? It is the companions of Muhammad, okay, and their companions. And the reasons why the Hadith is so important to the Muslims is because for Muslims, their salvation is contingent upon doing good works. Okay? You are saved by doing good works. And you're saved by following the example of Muhammad. Here's the problem. How many verses in the Quran speak of Muhammad? a grand total of 4. So you see the problem here. If we've got to follow the example of Muhammad, how can we follow the example of Muhammad? There's only 4 verses which speak of him. Well, in order to do that, they study the hadith. There are 6 major hadith, okay, and there are some hadith that are considered to be of more value than others, like Bukhari or Sahih Muslim. And they're appealing to those texts all the time, because that's where we know what Muhammad said to this person, said to that person. Most of Sharia law, okay, comes out of, do I need to use this? Because I don't have to use this thing. I'm loud enough and ugly enough to do. Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. So this is important to understand the importance of these works. So often when Muslims are discussing or saying things, they're making claims both from the Quran and the Hadith. And you want to be mindful of this.
I just changed the batteries quickly.
Okay.
You don't mind talking with this one?
No, I don't mind using a handheld. Let me just pull this off. And that.
All right, then you're good.
And there we go. Sharp. Okay, so this is important. Then alongside the Hadith, we have another group of works which is very important. This is called the Sirah. That means biographies. Why would a biography be important to the Muslims? What does a biography do? It tells you about the history of the person. Well, if you've got to follow the example of Muhammad, then biographies would be important. This is the most important one. This is the oldest and most important one within the Islamic, the life of Muhammad, written by Ibn Hisham and then through Ibn Ishaq. There's some new news on this thing, in which we used to lay credit or think that there was merit to this, but this is no longer a legitimate document to which to appeal on historic grounds, so we'll talk a bit about that. But nevertheless, you can see how that makes sense. So they all appeal to biographies. So often, for example, when you see Muslims do certain things, when they justify their actions, for example, in France, when the jihadists machine gunned those French secularists in the Charlie Hebdo affair, and they said to them, on what basis do you do this? They appealed to, not the Quran, they appealed to the Hadith and to the biography, because it's in this text that we find that there was a woman who was critical of Muhammad, and he didn't take lightly to her. And some guy went and murdered her, okay, and then he came back to Muhammad and said to him, you know, what's going to happen now? And Muhammad said, don't worry, 2 goats wouldn't butt heads over her. That's in here. Okay. This isn't some Christian conspiracy now. These are their texts. All right. So the model of Muhammad and his life is to be found in the Hadith and the Quran. This is posing major problems for Muslims, because now many Muslims are realizing it's one thing defending the Quran, but defending the integrity of this thing in the Hadith now is becoming a nightmare. And so now you've got what is called Quran-only Muslims. Okay. Because they realized in an effort to defend that kind of stuff, you're not going to do that. I mean, that's just reprehensible behavior. It's hardly the actions of a religious man to approve of the murdering of people. You know, to take an insult from a woman, and then when some guy goes and murders her, to say to him, don't worry, 2 goats wouldn't butt heads over her. So when we start to talk about Islam, okay, be very careful, because there's much you can say about Muhammad. My suggestion and recommendation to you is not to tackle Muhammad, because they care about him so much. Okay, I wouldn't lay my hand. It's good to know about the life of Muhammad, and the reason why is if you learn a bit about him, you will realize he is a magnificently false prophet. Okay, he is a false prophet. He's a man who suffered from exactly the same problems that all men suffer from, lust and sin, and you can demonstrate that from these texts. So once you've got a good relationship with Muslim brothers, you might want to ask some questions then. But it's important that we mention that as well. And then the other fourth most important section of works is the tafsir. The tafsir are the earliest biographies of Muhammad. These are commentaries. Not biographies, commentaries. So like what Calvin's Institute or to the Reform guys, or Aquinas' works, or early commentaries on the Church Fathers. These are the earliest commentaries, people like Ibn Kathir and others. Okay. All right, so this is the scriptures. They also believe in the prophets, but they draw their line through which prophet in the Old Testament? Through Ishmael. Okay, that's why they often were called and referred to as Ishmaelites. Okay, they draw their line through Ishmael. They are Ishmaelites. They are not Israelites. They are Ishmaelites. That's very important. But they believe in many of the other prophets of the Bible and many others. And they believe all those prophets were given revelation by God. And many of those revelations have been lost. And even though we have some of them in the Torah and the Injil, those ones are all corrupted, but the Quran isn't. They believe in angels, and they also believe in these other kinds of entities called jinn. That's where we get the word genie from. Okay? And these things feature in their theology. We're not going to have much time to talk about it. They believe Satan, as I understand, was a jinn as well. Interestingly enough, they believe in paradise, and they also believe in hell. So they believe in a day of judgment. They also believe a lot of interesting things about Jesus with respect to the day of judgment. And in addition to that, they also believe in jihad. Okay, what is jihad? Well, it can be many things to people. Some people talk about it as being an internal struggle of the religious person. But historically, we can look at the works and realize that Islam, in its early history, unlike Christianity, was spread by the sword. It was military conquest, where you would subjugate the nations, and we see this historically. We can track this. The Islam spread very quickly from Saudi Arabia all the way across North Africa within 1 century, and also went east, all the way up into Spain, and was very successful at conquering much of Europe all the way until in the 700s, Charles the Hammer stopped them, the Battle of Tours in France, and then the Europeans proceeded to kick the Muslims all the way out of Europe, and then got them all the way out of Spain, and that as well. So Islam lives in the shadow of the sword. Sorry? Yes. And there's a strategy there, ma'am, that will begin. Yep. Yeah, that's a strategy of theirs. They're very intentional in establishing Islam in any given community in that. But when they do reach a critical mass or majority, then believe you me, then, if they want to establish law, then things will ramp up, as the Europeans are finding now, and particularly in France. Because they now have large numbers now. So they're no longer some more, they're a little bit bolder in their thing. So if things aren't going out for them, well, we'll just use a bit of force to make our will, express our will. And so this is what the Europeans are struggling with now. They don't know how to deal with Islam. Even though the Europeans and the Muslims have had conflict since the time of Islam, there isn't a single century from the time of Muhammad until now that you cannot find military conflict between the Muslims and the Europeans. Not 1 century. Go and study it, the history of Islam and Europe's history. In every century, there's military conflict with the Europeans, beginning first with the Byzantines, and then all the way until the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the siege of Vienna, all of those Eastern European countries like Romania and all these countries, the ones that currently don't want immigrants in their countries, that's not accidental. That's not because they're racist. It's because they've got a history of conflict with Islam that the French and others seem to have forgotten about. Okay. In terms of the major beliefs, the 5 pillars of Islam, it's founded upon the Shahada, which is the confession that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his final messenger. This is whispered into the ear of a child when it's born, and into the ear of a person just before they die. And to say this thing and to make this confession helps a Muslim to purge themselves of their sins, to do good works. And so this is a central confession of theirs. They believe in prayer. They pray in a very particular way, often very regimented. It's prescribed to pray 5 times a day. Notice the prescription of prayers 5 times a day is not found in the Quran. It's found in the Hadith. Okay. There's many other things which Muslims do which you won't find prescribed in the Quran. They're found in the Hadith. All right. And they all pray and they build their mosques with the Qibla, or the place in where the sermon is given, facing towards Mecca, and they all often put their prayer mats down, or in mosques you'll often have carpets in which the areas are laid out. There's no furniture in there. They don't sit in chairs. They kneel. They sit on that, and this is it's worth visiting a mosque if you can. They believe in zakat, which is the giving of alms, much like us as Christians, and they also hold to a holy month, Ramadan, which is a very important month in the calendar of the Muslims, during which they fast during the day and remember some significant historical events with respect to Muhammad, and then in the evening they break fast. This is a good time to be engaging the Muslims, to be asking them about Ramadan. Why do you do this, and why do you have the meals, and to ask them about those questions. One of the things that is required of Muslims in their life, if they can, is to go on the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage back to Mecca. So although the pagans were all going to Mecca back in Muhammad's time, they continue today to do that. And if you can't go on the Hajj, they encourage you to do it if you can once in your lifetime. But you can go on the Hajj on behalf of others as well. So many people make multiple trips to the Hajj, and they center this week or so around all of these events, which have very important questions from which we can ask them many things. Okay, so they will gather around the Kaaba and have various services. Here's a picture of the Kaaba. Next slide. Closer up, it's a cube-shaped building, in which at the side of which is a meteorite, which they rub and they kiss. That for me has historically pagan roots, and so one of the questions is, why are you kissing that stone and hugging that stone? Like, that's a pagan practice, but they do it. So many of the things that they do at the Hajj, they do them because Muhammad did it. But if you ask them, well, why are you doing that? That's a pagan activity. They can't answer the question. They sacrifice thousands of sheep there because they commemorate Abraham's sacrifice of his son. But if you ask him, well, what's the point of the sacrificial system? They can't answer the question. These are good questions to begin asking Muslims. Because what we would argue, the entire sacrificial system which the Jews established was to point towards what? To Jesus, because we were looking at vicarious atonement. Because a Muslim will say, how can somebody else die for your sins? That's unjust. To which we're going to say, well then what on earth in the Old Testament is going on with the Levitical system and the temple of God? Which is fundamentally about one thing, what? The problem of sin. The priests are there to slaughter these animals and shed their blood and not your blood, because you have a problem with the Lord. But the sheep isn't guilty of anything. You are. And yet God said it's okay for you to do this for a period of time, but we all know that can't continue on forever, hey? That ultimately human blood needs to be atoned with human sin needs to be dealt with. They can't answer these questions. They just do it, but in a mindless kind of way. Well, because they did it back then. So there are very good questions here. They meet and pray around this mountain. They run between these two hills. They throw stones at these things, which is throwing stones at Satan. And they repeat all these things. They drink from the Zamzam well. All of these are issues around the Hajj that's worth studying, and from out of which we can ask some legitimate questions. In addition to this, Muslims are very evident by certain things that we see. The headdress, the wearing of the various headdresses is not mentioned in the Quran, by the way. That comes also, and that's why that's why some Muslim communities have different rules. You notice some of them go completely veiled, some of them cover just their heads. That's because amongst these sources here, not the Hadith, the debate in the Hadith and the Sirah is over what was prescribed. Okay. Like many religions, they celebrate a person's birth, the coming of age, marriage, and death, these rites of passage. Now, as we engage with Muslims now, what is our time now? I'm supposed to go into second session, so are we going to have a break or not? Or we're just going to go straight into it? Okay, so now we want to talk to some extent about engaging with Muslims, okay? There's many things that we could do, but in our limited time, I have discovered in all my work with the Muslims, there are three core issues around which all Muslim conversations, whether you're dealing with a more conservative Muslim or a liberal Muslim, these are the three questions that will always come up. And they will have to do with these three things: the deity of Christ, the doctrine of the Trinity, and the historicity of the Bible. Everything, in my experience, ultimately always breaks down to this. Okay, and so we want to be able to offer some responses to some of these issues. Okay, all right. Now, beginning with the deity of Christ, okay, it's important for us to understand, okay, and I think it's important to begin with that, because if we can establish the deity of Christ, then kind of we have got the second person of the Trinity. So I would not begin discussions on trying to make sense of the Trinity, okay, because I think you've got the cart in front of the horse. The reason why we have the doctrine was because of the early church's understanding of Jesus being Messiah and Messiah being God. If you can establish that Jesus is the Messiah and Messiah is God, then you've got the second person of the Trinity established. Okay. All right. So we're going to focus a lot of our efforts now on this issue now. Here are things affirmed by Muslims: that Jesus is born of a virgin. Jesus is called Messiah 11 times in the Quran. That's right. Jesus is called Messiah. He is sinless. Jesus performed miracles. And in their eschatology, he is coming back. Muhammad is dead and buried. You can go to his grave in Medina. He's in the ground like every other man. Okay? But they believe that Jesus. Now notice this now. That's a lot to work with there. And this is why my strategy when it comes to personal conversations then is to keep the conversation centered around Jesus. Because the Muslims actually believe a lot about Jesus that you and I would agree with. We would agree that those things are true, would we not? Okay. Here's a strong thing to say. You have more in common with your Muslim brothers concerning Jesus than many Dutch Reform and here church pastors. Ooh. Many Dutch Reformed pastors don't believe that Jesus is born of a virgin. They don't believe in the supernatural. The Messiah is a nonsense thing to them. So, they don't lay any credit to that. The Messiah is God. They don't believe that. Sin, they don't really believe in sin. We just got to be good people. Miracles, they don't happen. Jesus was just a good man teaching us moral principles, like a guru. That's what many Dutch Reformed pastors preach. And certainly, him coming back in the future, no. So you've got more in common with most Muslims than you do with a lot of liberal Christians. Okay. So these are some of the core issues then. Now, this doesn't mean, and we get excited when we say, whoa, when this is first shared with me, it's like, wow, that's a lot to work with. We've got some common ground. This is why I would say we want to start here. Reserve any question you might have for Muhammad for down the road, maybe when you've established a relationship with the person and you want to ask some questions of Muhammad. But this is where I would begin on a practical level of my conversation with Muslims. And in recent times, I've been really focusing on my studies on the Old Testament. I've realized if you were to ask me then, of all of those titles then, which one should I pick then to begin with? Now, which one would you think would be the best one to start with? Yeah, Jesus is Messiah. Okay, great, we got it now. So now we're going to center on all of those are worthy of asking questions of. Why is this in the question of miracles? Muhammad never performed miracles. All of these things. But Messiah is important. Why is that important? Yes, they can do that. Okay. So for us as Christians, why is it important? God is with us, Emmanuel 7:14. But the word Christ in the New Testament, or Christos, what is that? That's the Greek word. What does that mean? The word Christ in your Bible on every occasion just is the word Messiah. In fact, translations have actually done us a disservice. We shouldn't have the word Christ there because it actually gets away from the concept of Messiah. The establishment of Christianity, okay, is the foundation of that is that Christians, the early Christians were all Jews who believed that Jesus was Messiah. Okay. And the question of who the Messiah is and what the Messiah does is an Old Testament issue. It's not a New Testament thing. The New Testament is the fulfillment of those Old Testament prophecies. So when the Muslims come in and argue that all these Christian ideas that Jesus is God comes from Paul, which they'll typically say, or was from the Council of Nicaea, or it was Constantine, the problem with those arguments is they're all too late. Before Paul was even persecuting the church, there were Christians who were believing that Jesus is Messiah. In fact, go and read Stephen. In the sermon he preaches, he argues that Jesus is Messiah, and Paul then stands and watches them stone him. So this is all too late. This is the major problem with Islam. Islam comes 600 years after the events. It's too late. Muhammad didn't even know the companions of the companions of the companions of the companions of any of the early Christians. And yet people take what Muhammad believes as to be a clearer understanding of the events and convictions of the people who were eyewitnesses to Jesus. Not just the Christians, but the non-Christians. So here's an excellent thing. When you read the Bible, you can read your Bible alongside the works of Josephus, in which we find John the Baptist's account and him losing his head, in which we find the brother of Jesus, James, who becomes the head of the Jerusalem church, being martyred, in which we find references to Jesus and the disciples and all of the people they dealt with, Herod and everyone. We can read the New Testament alongside this and other historical sources like Tacitus. Now, what did the Muslims do with this then? Well, they believe Jesus is Messiah, but they don't believe that he was crucified. Surah 4, 157. They don't believe he was crucified. Now, that's a historical claim. If Jesus was crucified, Islam is false. On that one question. It's as simple as that. But they have to dismiss not only the biblical account, but also the non-biblical account. But what interest did Josephus have in lying about these things, or Tacitus? So they have to discredit all of this other history that comes alongside the New Testament. They don't have a historical leg to stand on. Bad history. Too late. Too late, Ahmed Dichter, too late. All right. And it's too late to even argue in the New Testament because, as I said, the issue of Jesus as Messiah is an Old Testament issue. It is a prophecy concerning the coming person. The two most significant individuals in the Old Testament is whom? The Lord and his coming Messiah. All right, so it's not for the Muslims or the Christians to say this is what Messiah is. We didn't decide who Messiah is. Messiah was revealed in the Old Testament to be discovered. We discovered truth. We didn't decide it. We don't go to the Old Testament and saying, this is what the Messiah is, 600 years after the fact. Okay, you can do that, but then that's you deciding beforehand, a priori, who the Messiah is. Okay, so now let's make our case now for Messiah, Jesus as Messiah. Because now we've got to set aside the New Testament in some sense. And we can go to many of the messianic passages to argue that Jesus is Messiah. Isaiah 7:14. The virgin will be with child. What do the Muslims believe? Jesus is born of a virgin. You're on board here. But you know, you've got to read the passage. You've got to go to Isaiah chapter 9. Get your Bibles out now when we can start making notes now. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 1. It tells us where the works of Messiah is going to begin. Where is it going to begin? In Galilee. Remember, Jesus meets all of these prophetic prophecies in the Old Testament. Think of Micah 5:2. Be born in Bethlehem. Zechariah is going to come in on a donkey. All of these prophecies are given, which Jesus meets all of those. Key concepts of Messiah, that he will come and is tied to the covenant promises with David, the branch of David, the root of Jesse. Isaiah talks about this and the root and the branch in the book of Isaiah. If you want to study one book, or two books, that really anchor this concept of the identity and the works of Messiah, the book of Isaiah and the book of Daniel. Those are your two key texts. And then there's one, it's the most powerful passage of all to use with the Muslims. We're going to get to that. I'm going to save that for the end. Okay, so now we're in the book of Isaiah. We read on in Isaiah, and then we have this messianic prophecy that this child that would be conceived would come in and bring to an end war. And that this child will be called Counselor, Mighty God. Who is that? And the question is to the Jew as well. Since when is this child called Mighty God? Now, of course, the Muslim is just going to have to say, oh, the Bible is corrupted. Because you've already decided beforehand what you think the child should be. Again, 600 years, and in this case of the Old Testament, thousands of years after the fact. The problem for the Muslim, okay, is that we have, as a result of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have discovered amongst them 2 complete copies of the great Isaiah scroll. So even before Jesus is born, there you have a manuscript which lays out the identity and the works of Messiah. Before Christianity. So don't give me your Paul nonsense here now. Yeah, you have an Old Testament text 100 years before the birth of Jesus, which talks about these same prophecies. So we can get into the historical side of this as well in terms of manuscripts. Okay? What other verses might we then think about that are important in Isaiah? What other works do you might think are important in Isaiah? Hey? Oh, absolutely. But what is 53 giving us? If Isaiah 9 is giving us identity, what is 53 giving us? His works. His works. Okay. Now we can talk about the identity in Isaiah, and you'll get 2 themes. You'll get, in the book of Isaiah, you'll get the servant Israel, and then you'll get the suffering servant. You'll get the great contrast between Israel, who is thoroughly corrupt and worthless. If you're not convinced, okay, just go to Isaiah 59. If you're not convinced that God, despite his love for Israel, okay, he says this of them. Listen to this description of Israel. Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened, and that it cannot save, or his ear dull, that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have made a separation between you and God. Your sins have hidden his face from him, so that he does not hear. Your hands have defiled with blood, your fingers with iniquity. Your lips have spoken lies. Your tongue uttered wickedness. No one enters suit justly. No one goes to the law honestly. They rely on empty pleas. They speak lies. They conceive mischief and give birth to iniquity. They hatch adders' eggs. They weave spiders' webs. And on and who's that a description of? Israel. So when people come in, including Jewish apologists, who say to them, no, the servant here is Israel, well then who's this? Because apparently the suffering servant is a righteous person. This is clearly not the case. And many other verses establish this. In fact, the verse chapter 59 is contrasted with verse 58, where it says, the pagan brothers. What does it talk about here? It talks about these. The eunuchs, the untouched, are more righteous than are you, Israel. We have another contrast, for example, in Isaiah chapter 40. I think it's chapter 42. Let me go here. Yes. Look at the contrast. End of chapter 41. But when I look, there is no one. Among these there is no counselor, who when I gives an answer. Behold, they are all a delusion. Their works are nothing. Their metal images are empty. Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. Well, has God got some kind of schizophrenic doublespeak here? No, it's because there's two servants. There's the one that Israel ought to have been but never met, and then there's the suffering servant. This is why the Jews were looking for the Messiah, because they were well aware that he would be righteous. He will not cry aloud or lift up his voice. He will bring justice forth to the nations. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be discouraged until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his law. Thus says the law, says God, the Lord who created the heavens and earth and stretched them out. So there we have the contrast between the suffering servant and the servant of Israel. So look, and I'm only doing a light duty here to this now. It's much deeper than this. Let's go to the book of Daniel. Okay? What does Messiah mean? It means anointed one. Nowhere in the Bible is there more explicit mention of this than in Daniel chapter 9. End of Daniel chapter 9, 70 weeks are decreed. Here we have God's prophecy wasn't some vague kind of thing. Things are going to happen in the future. Bad things and good things. How about that for a prophecy from Simon Brace? If I said to you, I've got a prophecy for you. There will be events in Piet Retief, and some people will get married, and others will have difficulties in their marriage, but things will work out fine. Somewhere down the future, the potholes will be filled. What kind of a prophecy is that? That's the kind of prophecy that many churches are giving to people now. Huh? Yes. The Bible God gives you like specific prophecy. This is going to happen. Think of the vision in Daniel. This nation following this nation will all come and go. Then he names people. Cyrus will be my servant. He's also called Messiah, the anointed one. And then we find in Daniel, Jeremiah is told that they will go into exile for how long? 70 years. They're given a timeline. Jeremiah is given that. In Daniel chapter 9 at the beginning, what does Daniel say? I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that according to the word of the Lord Jeremiah, the prophet must pass before the end. So Daniel is reading Jeremiah and says, it's 70 years, folks, we have hope. This too shall pass. And then in his desire for his people and their return, and this amazing character God gives him this amazing revelation and gives him not only the hope of Israel, but the hope of nations, because he gives him the timeline of the countdown of Messiah. From the time of the building of the temple to then, what's going to happen? Listen to us carefully now. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore, to build Jerusalem, to the coming of the Messiah, anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and a moat, but it will be in troubled time. And after 62 weeks the anointed one shall be cut off. So at the time of Jesus, we have huge messianic expectation. Why? Because of these verses. Go to Isaiah chapter 7. Verse 13 to 14. And I saw in the night visions, and behold, the clouds of heaven, there came one like the Son of Man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and presented before him, and to him was given a dominion, glory, kingdom, and that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away. What's this? Who is that? That's the Messiah. The Jews know this. They told that David was going to have a king who would be an eternal king sitting on his throne eternally, and all people would serve him. What are you doing serving this person? I thought we were meant to serve God. But here God says, this person will be the king, and you will all people and nations. And of course we find this fulfilled in Jesus, and Paul talks about that in Philippians 2. So here we have core messianic prophecies. Okay? Now I confronted the Muslims with Daniel 7 and 9. You know what they said? Yeah, it's corrupted. It's an easy out, eh? And I said to him, on what basis? From a testimony 600 years after the New Testament and thousands of years before these events, you conveniently just throw the Bible out? Because remember, they believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So here's the thing that the Muslims are in. They're in a predicament now, because how do you bring these two verses together? That the anointed one would come at a specific date and time, that he would be cut off, and that he would also be given this kind of authority, which connects beautifully with all these passages in Isaiah. How do we deal with that? I said to him, well, in order to answer that question, Jesus is going to solve the conundrum for you. Let's go to the book of Matthew. Jesus is on trial now before Caiaphas the high priest. Okay? He's been abandoned by the disciples. Okay? Picking it up around, let's pick it up at verse 59. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death, but they found no one, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. And the high priest, this is Caiaphas, stood up and said, have you answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But Jesus remained silent. Another fulfillment of prophecy. Like a sheep before its shearers. He was the same in front of Pilate, until Pilate got lost his temper within him, and he said to Jesus, do you not know that I have the power to crucify you? And Jesus responded to him and said to him, this is great. You would have no power unless it was given to you from above. How about that, to shut Pilate's mouth? That's powerful. I mean, that's a powerful response by Jesus. But here we find Caiaphas. Now listen, look at the question here. And the high priest asked him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are not Christ, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? Which means the Jews understood that the Messiah was the Son of God. Jesus said to you, you have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. What's that a reference to? Daniel chapter 7. And Daniel chapter 9 come together in this passage. He brings us, and what's the response? Then the high priest tore his robes and said, he has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment? He deserves death. Then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him and said, prophesy to us, you, not Christ, you Messiah. Who is it that struck you? Prophesy to us, Messiah. Everywhere it says Christ, cross it out, put Messiah there. That's not an illegitimate thing to do. It's Messiah. It's not Christ. It's Messiah. We need to use that term, especially with Muslims. We talk about Jesus not as Christ. We talk about him as Messiah. You say he's Messiah. We are Messianians. Early Christians were followers of Messiah. We are Messianians. That's the foundation of our faith. And it's not a New Testament issue. It is an Old Testament Jewish issue, because they were given the identity and the works of Messiah, and Jesus is here fulfilling that in these very acts and these statements. The New Testament, in some sense, has got nothing to do with the identity and the works of Messiah. So for the Muslims saying, well, the New Testament, Paul did this, and too late. Too late. It's an Old Testament issue. It's a Jewish question, and which means you also have to deal with it, because you believe that Jesus is Messiah. As we've said, you believe he's born of a virgin. So what happens is the Muslims, interestingly enough, are in the same predicament as the disciples. Go to Matthew chapter 16. And this is what I argued in my closing statement with the Muslims. I said, you guys are like the disciples in Matthew 16, in that you have a partial view of the Messiah. Remember, if Messiah is the second most important person mentioned in the Old Testament, it's not for the Christians to decide that, neither is it for the Muslims. If you believe in Allah's revelation, it's Allah who revealed his coming Messiah. And he's the one who dictates who he will be, which he lays out, that he will come from the root of David, which means he's going to be an Israelite, he's not going to be an Ishmaelite. Sorry to burst your bubble, boys. He's going to be Jewish. Salvation is from the Jews. Whether we like it or not, God has picked them, and it's through them that He has revealed His salvation. You can get grumpy about that. You can wonder why He didn't pick an Englishman or a Scandinavian, or of course He picked the Jews, and that's who He picked. Come to terms with it. This is what Jesus says to the Samaritan woman. You know not what of you believe. Salvation is from the Jews. And so we can hold their feet to the fire. It's an Old Testament issue. And we can press them with this. Now, a lot of the time, if I was to say to you, everybody's heard about the get behind me statement. Get behind me, Satan. Okay, who was that rebuke given to? Peter. But when you ask people, what is the rebuke all about? Most people can't tell you. But if we look in the context, we have a beautiful passage here, which I think is a powerful way to engage the Muslims. So let's go to Matthew chapter 16, pick it up in verse 13. In this situation, Jesus is having a conversation with the disciples. And he says, now when Jesus came to the district of Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? So Jesus is starting the conversation now. Which is the title Jesus uses of himself more than any other in the New Testament? Son of Man. Very important. 29 times in the book of Matthew, 14 times in the book of Mark, 24 times in the book of Luke, and I think 10 times in the book of John. Nearly 80 times. The Muslims all acknowledge this. Christ calls himself the Son of Man. Now notice, we see this. We see this in many conversations. It's very important. Son of Man, Son of God, Messiah. Okay, very important. So Jesus asks him, who do people say the Son of Man is? And so they respond and say, well, some say Elijah, some say this, some say that. And then Jesus says to them, but who do you say I am? And Peter responds, says, you are the Messiah. You are the Messiah. Then he goes on, and Jesus said to them, blessed are you, Simon. And then he says to them, I will build my church. Now, of course, the Catholics think that they build a church upon Peter's authority. That's not what's going on here. The church is founded not upon Peter's authority, but upon his confession that Jesus is Messiah. The reason why we are here today at this church and in every other church, including the Catholics one, is because of one truth. Jesus is Messiah. We are Christians. We are Messianians. Those who believe that Jesus is the Messiah as revealed in the Old Testament and that Jesus is the fulfillment of that are Christians who believe that in his works and what he called us to. Okay? Then he goes on. Just after Peter says this right, he goes on to say, from this time Jesus began to show the disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things in the elders, priests, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And now Peter interrupts him and says, no. I love you, Lord. I know that you are Messiah, but there'll be none of that. Thank you very much. No going to Jerusalem. And then what happens? What happens? He gets the rebuke. Get behind me, Satan. In the context, the rebuke here given to Peter is over not the identity of Messiah, but his works. Peter's not rebuked, he's just being commended. He's rebuked because he thinks he knows what Messiah should and shouldn't do. And this is what the Muslims think. You've got the identity correct, just like Peter, but you don't know the works of Messiah. Because you deny that he went to Jerusalem to be crucified and was raised from the dead. Surah 4:157. But it's not for you to decide that. And what about the Quran? 600 years too late. Peter is rebuked here. So the same rebuke that goes to Peter goes to the Muslims. because they think they're going to decide what the works of Messiah is. It's not for them to decide that. In fact, we know that these works aren't even established here. Where is the works of Messiah given to us? Ma'am? Where do we know about this? You mentioned it, Isaiah 53. You see, it's got nothing to do with the New Testament in some sense, because we know the suffering servant would have to be crushed for our iniquities, that he would be pierced, that he would be hung and crucified along criminals and buried with the rich man. All of that is there. Long before this comes to the mouth of Jesus, it's already established in the Old Testament that he would be come back to his temple and he would be cut off, Daniel chapter 9. And because of this, God would confer all authority to him, Daniel 7. Jesus together brings these things together us in his confrontation with Caiaphas, and he's establishing that here. So what's wrong with the Muslims' view of Jesus as Messiah? They have a partial understanding of who Jesus is. It's a Jewish issue. It's an Old Testament issue. It's got, in some sense, little to do with the New Testament. These are the kinds, I think, of questions that we need to put in front of Muslims. Okay? All right. So, we see this now, and we can make many other arguments here, like the Son of Man arguments. Because if people say, if Jesus is the Son of Man, then you can say to them, well, who did Jesus claim the Son of Man was? Jesus said the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. I thought God was Lord of the Sabbath. So obviously Jesus is a liar, or he's a lunatic, or he's Lord. Jesus says the Son of Man will forgive sins. Mark chapter 2, you know, the paralytic man comes down, and then Jesus says your sins are forgiven, and they say, who does this guy think he is? Only God can forgive sins. And then Jesus says to them, so that you may know that the Son of Man has the power to forgive sins, which makes the Son of Man God. Get up. The Son of Man is judge of mankind. The Son of Man is the Son of God. Go through the New Testament next time you read it. Identify all instances of the Son of Man. Look in the context and see who Jesus is identifying there. Okay, so we've got some good stuff here to say. Here we go. Who is the Son of Man? Next slide. Okay. Yeah, we find even John 10. Muslims say Jesus never claimed to be the Son of Man. You hear that? Of course he did. He claimed to be Son of Man in Mark chapter 10. How do we know that? Because the people who crucified him said, you who are a mere man claim to be God. So either you take Muhammad 600 years after the fact, or the people who actually crucified Jesus. Caiaphas said to them, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? He said, yes, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man. And they said, you've heard the blasphemy. Of course he claimed to be God. That's what got him crucified. He got crucified for claiming to be God, according to the words of the very people who crucified him. All right, so this is important. So now we want to deal in. So if we can establish then that Jesus is the Messiah and that the Messiah is God, then we've got the second person of the Trinity. Okay, you see how that works? And what we tend to do there is not give some sophisticated arguments. We just keep going back to the Old Testament, keep going back to the Old Testament, keep going back to the Old Testament. Jesus is fulfilling these things. Daniel and Isaiah and all of these messianic prophecies. Now we can press the Muslims even further. Because like I said to him, well, we don't believe in the Trinity because God could never become a man. Oh, really? This is also a problem for the Jews. How could we argue that God, because when you hear the Muslims say this, God could never become a man, okay, you ask him, well, how so? Because the Muslims also believe in the burning bush. So the Muslims believe that God can manifest himself as a burning bush. They believe that he manifested himself as a cloud of pillar, that he descended on the mountain with Moses. They believe in the theophanies that we believe in the Old Testament, Exodus 3. There are many theophanies. Think of the one of Joshua, the man who comes and stands in front of him. I am commander of the Lord's army. Whose side are you on? I'm not on anyone's side, but I am the commander of the Lord's army. Through the book of Judges, we see these theophanies appearing there. But particularly the one with Moses is very powerful. That's in the Quran. I said to him, you believe that God can incarnate, that we believe that too. So who is that? But here's the problem. They also believe in the story of Abraham. Chapter 18. This is powerful. And I only learned this recently, like the last few weeks. And I learned this from my Jewish Messianic friends. Have you got Bible Hub on your phones? Who of you has got one of these great new devices here? You know, you can go like Bible Hub. One which can show you the Hebrew. Okay. Have you got it? Okay, that's fine. I use Bible Hub. Go to Bible Hub, Genesis chapter 18, and raise up the Hebrew. 3 people appear to Abraham. 3 men. 2 of them go on to be the destroying angels that will destroy Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. 1 of them speaks to Abraham. And it's often referred to as the Lord or the messenger, the angel of the Lord. There is no angel there. Even the English the Hebrew doesn't mention angel. It is a messenger. Angel just means messenger. But here's what's really powerful. Throughout the whole chapter, the word there, Lord, that is used of the person speaking to Abraham is not Adonai or Elohim. It's Yahweh. It's the Tetragrammaton. So now you have a man who's claiming who is Yahweh speaking to Abraham. He even rebukes Sarah because Sarah overhears it and she laughs. The rebuke from the Lord there, the word in Hebrew, is the Tetragrammaton. So when Jews say Yahweh could never become a man, I'm going, so what's happening in Genesis chapter 18? And you can take them to the Hebrew. You say God could never become a man. That's an assertion. Give me an argument for why that's not the case. You won't get one. And then what do you do with Genesis chapter 18? It looks like Yahweh became a man and spoke to Abraham. Who is that? Well, you and I know it's a pre-incarnate Christ. They're 8. And we've got all these theophanies there. The burning bush, it's the same person there. So here's now a response to the Trinity. The reason why Christians believe in the Trinity, again, is not a New Testament issue. It's an Old Testament issue. Because the complex nature of God is revealed in the Old Testament, in which even the Jew is confronted with the fact that Yahweh is speaking to Abraham as a physical person. Now, the only other option is for you to just say, as a Jew or a Muslim, is the text is corrupted. Which is what they ultimately are going to end up having to do. What I want you to do is I want you to know that the complex nature of the Trinity is grounded in these Old Testament passages, because there we find the nature of God being revealed, we find the nature of the Messiah being revealed, and we find the works of Messiah being laid out. The New Testament is merely a fulfillment of those things. The doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of the deity of Christ is first and foremost an Old Testament issue. And that's where we make our arguments. What then of the corruption then? We need to deal with that in the remaining time that I have. Well, here's what's interesting. The Muslims say the Bible is corrupted. There's all these variants. That's true. We acknowledge that there are variants in the Bible. But we don't make the same claim that Muslims do. Okay? The Muslims believe that the Quran has been perfectly preserved since the time of Muhammad to now. That's what they say. Here's one question to ask them. Well, let's say, for example, the Bible is corrupted. Prove to me that the Quran is historically reliable. You will not get an answer. They have nothing to offer you. Notice the double standard. They expect Christians to provide a defense for the reliability of the Bible, but they can offer nothing for the Quran. It's a mere assertion. But here's what we can say. You pick up a Greek New Testament. What you have here is you have the Greek, and below that you have the textual apparatus. What is the textual apparatus? That tells you where the Greek comes from. That tells you which manuscripts have been appealed to. We have a transparent system which any scholar can evaluate, can look at the Greek and can look at the manuscript tradition. We know where our variants are. We know about the end of Mark. We know about the woman caught in adultery. We know about 1 John 5:7. And you can even, we're not trying to hide those variants. The Muslims say the Quran is perfectly preserved from the time of Muhammad to now. That's just a lie. Oh, the Bible has many translations. By the way, so does the Quran. We now know that there are more than 30 Qurans. Which translation of the Quran do you want? Do you want the Warsh translation? Do you want the Hafs translation? This only came out recently in the last 20 years. When this was revealed by Hatun Tash at Speaker's Corner, they tried to stab her to death. So which Quran, Mr. Muslim? Which translation? When was the Quran canonized? When was the canon closed on the Quran? 1925. That's fairly recently. We now are beginning for the first time to begin to ask then, what is the nature of the relationship between the Quranic text and the manuscripts, which is fair because we say our Bible can be reflected. You take any Quran, and you'll typically have the Arabic on the one side, and then the translation on the next slide. You ask any Muslim, where is this Arabic from? Can't tell you. We can demonstrate where our text is from. You've got nothing. We don't know where that Arabic is from. What is the relationship between your Arabic and your manuscripts? They don't know. They can't give you an answer to the question. There is no text-critical Quran. We now also know that their manuscripts are full of thousands of variants. Here's one of my friends who did a study on just Surah 14, in which he's showing all of the variants in the Quran. So if the Bible has variants in it, and you throw it out, then on the same basis, you should throw the Quran out as well. Why? Because it has thousands of variants. It's another double standard from the Muslims. But we don't make the claim. We don't claim perfect preservation as you do. You make the claim. This issue has only surfaced in the last 20 years. I encourage you to go onto YouTube and look for a discussion between Muhammad Hijab and Yasser Qadi. Because this issue became so prominent, these Muslim guys decided to prove, for one of these guys said he would go to the top Muslim scholar in the world and say, show us how we've got perfect preservation from the time of Uthman all the way to now. And what did the scholar say to him? The standard Islamic narrative is full of holes. It's not the case. Yasser Qadi and Muhammad Hijab. Yasir and Muhammad Hijab, Hijab. They recorded this thing. It went onto the internet. People recorded the whole thing, and then when they realized what they'd done, they tried to scrub it off the internet. And so every year, Christians all over the world and Muslims who've converted now because of these lies about the Quran are reposting this video, but they constantly get the Muslim to scrub it and scrub it and scrub it and scrub it. Because what it does is it undermines this claim of perfect preservation. So when the Muslims come in and say, well, the Bible is corrupted, I'm going, well, you know, that's interesting because it looks like the Quran is also corrupted. It's got thousands of variants in it. What's worse is we don't even know what the relationship is between your early manuscript traditions like the Topkapi or the Sana manuscripts in the Arabic. We don't know what that relationship is. We at least can give you something in the New Testament. You can offer us nothing. So why the double standard then? Why the double standard? Okay. Furthermore, there's a problem for the Muslims. Because the Muslims believe that Allah has revealed His revelation and that He will preserve it. I forget the verse off the top of my head. So this is a different kind of argument. Well, here's a problem then. They would argue, well, Allah has preserved the Quran. Even if we can't give a defense of it, He has, right? Because the Quran says so, which is a circular argument. And remember, you ask the Christians to give you historical defense, but you can't offer one of your own text. And then you say, well, because Allah preserves it. Well, Allah revealed the other revelations as well. So what's wrong with Allah? Why can he only protect 1/3 of his revelation? You see the inconsistency there? If you claim Allah preserved it, and he's preserved the Quran, then he's also preserved the Bible and the Old Testament. But you don't believe that. And furthermore, making the claim of perfect preservation is different from demonstrating that there is a reliability to the text. So again, when you make the arguments for Jesus Messiah from the Old Testament, and they come back at you and say these things are just corrupted, here's what you do. You do the polemics. You can say to them, well, let's say, for example, say the Bible is corrupted and untrustworthy. Why should I think that the Quran is historically reliable? Like John said, you ask them the question, why? And what will you hear from them? Nothing. So it's interesting. You expect the Christians to give a defense of the reliability of the Bible, and you throw that out, but the Muslims have nothing to offer us. Well, Allah said he would preserve it. Well, that's the claim. Demonstrate that. What is the relationship between your manuscript tradition and the modern day Arabic? Because in the New Testament, we can show that. I just showed it to you. This is a text critical script. There's the Greek. Below that is the manuscripts. We know where our Greek comes from. You take any Quran, you don't know where the Arabic is from. Is it from the Topkapi, or how do those things relate to each other, and what are the variants? Here's what's worse. New scholarship has shown that they tried to get the manuscripts to conform to modern day translations. That's right. They went back into the manuscripts and started scratching out parts of the Quran and writing over it. You might have a problem with that. Oh yeah. This is the recent scholarship now on the Quran. Okay? And this has only happened in the last 25, 30 years. This is why this question needs to be asked of the Quran. So for me, the engagement with the Muslims is fundamentally on the question of Jesus, because they believe he's Messiah. I'm going to summarize for you now. And they have a partial understanding of who he is, like the disciples had, that Jesus corrected. That the concept of Messiah is not a New Testament issue. It's fundamentally an Old Testament issue. In addition to that, the complex nature of God is revealed in the theophanies in the Old Testament, like Genesis 18, for example, or Moses in the burning bush, and all which the Jews have to deal with as well. And then finally, when it comes to the reliability of the Quran, you have a double standard. You believe Allah can preserve the Quran, but was Allah not strong enough to preserve the other revelations? What's wrong with him? And furthermore, even if I grant you that Allah did preserve the Quran, then can you demonstrate that to me? Because it looks like there's variance here. It's looked like you're retroactively manipulating manuscripts. Like, that's a serious charge, that you basically go to a modern day translation, realize that your manuscript tradition doesn't marry up, so you go back into the old manuscripts and you start scratching out things. Like, that's a pretty serious charge, that. And that's why they're trying to scrub this thing off the internet now. But too late. Isn't it amazing how God can use even their own scholars to undermine that thing now? Okay, so that's where I'd focus. Now, again, there's lots of other stuff that we could deal with here with Muslims, because you can talk about the Hajj, Abraham's sacrifice, why do you do these things and that. But where I would begin is where I think we should begin, because it gets you close to Jesus. Keep the conversation about Jesus, because they give you a lot to work with, particularly the concept of Messiah. Okay? And as you bridge and learn more about Islam, you can expand out. I've taken the time to do some of that work, so I can do that. But that's where I would begin with the conversations. Okay? And move it to the Old Testament. And be ready for the historical. This is where most conversations will go with Muslims, in my experience. And then above all things, remember this, as with anybody, as apologists, we're not trying to reason people or argue people into the kingdom of heaven. Nobody gets into the kingdom of heaven unless the Holy Spirit confronts them on a moral level. It is the Holy Spirit that is our partner. We have the privilege to participate in our witnessing to people. But we cannot just proclaim truth without the Spirit. Remember, the Holy Spirit is called the Spirit of Truth. We are there to be ambassadors of truth, serving alongside the Holy Spirit, because only He can deal with those people at a fundamental level where you and I cannot access them. So we are always praying, as Paul calls us to, and elsewhere in Scriptures, praying fervently on all occasions, for all things, for all people, at all times. It never stops, or ought never to stop in the church. So make sure, now that I've armed you with a few questions now, that before you go to Muslims, always, always, always pray. And know this, even if you go to the Muslims, and it feels like you've butted your head up against a concrete wall, fear not. God will use your efforts in ways you cannot even fathom. My wife had a conversation with a Muslim girl at Speaker's Corner in London. The conversation might have been 5 minutes long. And it's a tough environment. Some of these guys were suicide bombers in London. These are hardcore Muslims. 7 years later, this woman tracks down my wife on social media. Says, you know that conversation you had with me? She's like, what? She says, I've become a believer now. Thank you for speaking to me. So don't underestimate your efforts. Just have the courage to do your homework, to study to show yourself approved, to get some focus now. And I've given you some places to focus on. Jesus as Messiah, Old Testament, do those passages. Ask good questions about the Quran. Don't be afraid of the polemic. Well, let's say, for example, Christianity is false and Christianity is corrupted, the Bible is corrupted. Why should I believe the Quran is true? That's a legitimate question. Come on, give me an argument for that. What's with all the variants in the Quran? Because that's now been laid out. Their own scholars have made that confession that the standard narrative that has been perfectly preserved is false. Your own scholars have said that. Come on, why should I think of it? They have nothing. They have nothing to offer you. So well, this is a double standard now. So we have some good questions to ask of the Muslims, to challenge them on these issues and these questions, but be praying on all occasions. And I would submit to you, if you've got a community here of Christians in this church, one of the things you could potentially do is you can form a group, a study group, and I can connect you, if you're interested, I can connect you into a group of people that's doing like in-depth studies on these issues, and they're doing some online training in which they show you this stuff and a lot more. I mean, I'm just scratching the surface here now, okay? But that's maybe a bit further down the road. All right, I'm done now, and we'll wrap up then.